Hijo de la justicia, ¿dónde puede ir un amante? Si no es a la tierra de su amada. ¿Y qué buscador encuentra descanso? Lejos del deseo de su corazón, lejos del deseo de su corazón. Para el verdadero amante la reunión es vida y la separación es muerte, es muerte. De paciencia y su corazón no está en paz. Su pecho está desprovisto de paciencia y su corazón no está en paz. Hijo de la justicia, ¿dónde puede ir un amante? Si no es a la tierra de su amada. ¿Y qué buscador encuentra descanso? Lejos del deseo de su corazón, lejos del deseo de su corazón. Para el verdadero amante la reunión es vida y la separación es muerte, es muerte. Por apresurarse a la morada de su amada. Renunciaría a una mirada
people wonder where law comes from. In an obvious sense, law comes from lawmakers. It could be a king, or in a modern context, legislative bodies like the U.S. Congress or the various state legislatures or the city council. But if we dig deeper, we can see that there are several possible sources for the law's authority. So there's natural law theory. On this view, there are principles of right and wrong that are part of the nature of the universe as much as the laws of math or logic or physics. Most natural law theorists argue that God's law is the fundamental underwriting theory of justification for man-made laws. There's also a secular natural law tradition. In either case, the main idea is that legislators are trying to figure out what right and wrong really are and what principles we should live by. To be a valid law on this view is to conform with the natural law. An unjust law, then, isn't really a law. One example would be in the Declaration of Independence, they declared their rebellion against the royal authorities on the grounds that it was no longer morally binding on them. Similarly, in the civil rights movement, the argument was that the segregation laws, being manifestly unjust abrogations of human nature, were meant to be violated because they could not be seen as binding on the conscience. There's also an idea that there's no such thing as natural law, that the natural law theory is entirely disconnected from political realities of laws and lawmaking. This is known as legal positivism. On this view, the laws are whatever the lawmakers say, and a law will be valid just in case it's procedurally valid. For example, in federal law in the United States, if it was passed by both houses of the legislature and signed by the executive, then it's the law, provided, of course, that it's not found to be unconstitutional by the judicial branch. In the positivist tradition, law is disconnected from considerations of morality. As long as the law has been passed in proper procedural form, then that makes it valid. For example, in Nazi Germany, all of the laws pertaining to the extermination of Jews and the rounding up of undesirables for the concentration camps were consistent with German law at the time. So what they did was not illegal in any positivist sense of the word. And in the United States, prior to the 1860s, slavery was entirely legal. So if a slave escaped to the north, the law required that the slave be returned. And there's another sense of law which doesn't even involve kings or politicians. In the evolution of many societies, we see the development of law in what could be seen as an organic process. All societies will need to discover ways of living and working together, so it makes sense that they would develop rules for regulating their interactions with each other. This might seem like random trial and error, but it's actually an evolutionary process that yields stable but also flexible and gradually changing procedures which are like laws for those communities. The English common law and customary law, the international merchant law that developed in the Middle Ages, these are some examples of this process in action. What counts as validity in this model is the extent to which the rules actually do facilitate social interaction and accord with people's general sensibilities about right and wrong and efficiency. Understanding law as an evolutionary process is probably the best way to make sure that on the one hand we have stable rules that people can understand and use to coordinate their behavior, but at the same time provide for flexibility and individuality and cultural pluralism. A system like this is generally more conducive to freedom than more authoritarian top-down systems.
appreciate your invitation to give this web talk, and thanks to everybody. So I'm very excited to be sharing some thoughts with you. Today I would like to really explore some of my personal reflections on the nature and application of Baha'i law, but with the understanding that, like all of Baha'u'llah's revelation, it is a system the like of which mortal eyes have never witnessed. So let me just share with you a few, if we can go to the next slide. I thought I would share with you just an overview of my talk today. So first of all, I would like to just explore how we think about Baha'i law, and then briefly talk about how it's part of a system the like of which mortal eyes have never witnessed. Then I'd like to explore some of the many interrelated layers of Baha'i law. It's not really just one uniform body of law. And then move on and just briefly compare Baha'i law with other major legal traditions of the world. And then finally reflect on how this kind of understanding of the nature and different layers of Baha'i law, as well as these similarities and differences, can help all of us as Baha'is, whatever our professions, whether legal or not, better share the teachings and apply those teachings in the field of law. So that's where we're headed. We can go to the next slide then. So first of all, how do we think about Baha'i law? So I think we first of all have to recognize that whenever we hear the word law, all kinds of images come to mind, like a police officer arresting a suspect, like maybe filling out our taxes, dealing with tax law. So the first thing we really need to do is overcome our own biases based on the cultural norms that we have absorbed and the legal traditions of our own societies, and try to understand that the Baha'i law is really unique. And that it stands apart from all of these existing human legal traditions, even though, of course, various aspects of it have similarities with those traditions. And, of course, I will have a chance to explore just a few of those similarities, but also some of the differences as well as we go along. So, first of all, we need to really see Baha'i law with our own eyes. And in general, Baha'u'lláh teaches us in the hidden words. He says, "The best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom if thou desirest me, and neglect it not, that I may confide in thee. By its aid," he says, "thou shalt see with thine own eyes and not through the eyes of others, and shall know with thine own knowledge and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor." So really, this is a fundamental principle that Baha'u'lláh has brought, that we need to investigate all things through our own eyes, but with the aid of justice. And so, again, that's the spirit in which we will approach looking at Baha'i law. Furthermore, as I have already alluded to, we need to understand that Baha'i law really is a system that human eyes have never seen before. It is not comparable to existing human bodies of law. And indeed, Baha'u'lláh in general says that his entire revelation is something that mortal eyes have never seen. He says, "Mankind's ordered life hath been revolutionized through the agency of this unique, this wondrous system, the like of which mortal eyes have never witnessed." And clearly Baha'i teachings on law are part of this really distinguished and remarkable system that is truly revolutionary. So one of the ways in which it's revolutionary is that it is not just a system of law in the traditional sense that we're thinking of, whether we think of with codes, with written statutes, with regulations. I mean, clearly all of those are pieces and parts of Baha'i law, but of course, Baha'u'lláh himself says and underscores in the Kitab-i Aqdas, his book of laws, which is also referred to as the most holy book, "Think not that we have revealed unto you a mere code of laws. Nay, rather, we have unsealed the choice wine with the fingers of might and power. To this beareth witness that which the pen of revelation hath revealed. Meditate upon this, O men of insight." So what beautiful poetic imagery here, that his book of laws is not just a mere code. It is the choice wine and beareth witness to his entire revelation. So again, this illustrates the tremendous power of Baha'u'llah's legal system that he has revealed, but the fact that it also has a spiritual essence that distinguishes it from a mere code of laws. He also, of course, counsels religious leaders not to judge his revelation by the standards of their own traditions, the standards of their own legal systems. So he says, for example, say, O leaders of religion, weigh not the book of God with such standards and sciences as are current amongst you. For the book itself is the unerring balance established amongst men. In this most perfect balance, whatsoever the peoples and kindreds of the earth possess must be weighed, while the measure of its weight should be tested according to its own standard, did he but know it. So again, he's urging even religious leaders not to simply judge his revelation based on existing religious laws, existing religious perspectives. Again, underscoring how distinguished it is. So with that understanding in mind, I wanted to investigate what I perceive to be many interrelated layers of Baha'i law. And so there's not one uniform Baha'i law. And even if we look at the Kitabi Aqdas itself, the book of laws, we find in there many different kinds of laws. And if, of course, we look at the much broader ocean of Baha'u'llah's revelation, we see many, many different layers of law, all of which are interrelated, but which serve different functions. And so I've tried to identify a few of these layers. So one of them is Baha'i law that nevertheless articulates divine and timeless principles. So for example, the law of love, the golden rule. These are all laws that Baha'u'llah has renewed from prior dispensations, and we know that they will always be part of the law of God. So that is a critical part of Baha'i law. But then also Baha'u'llah has brought new social and spiritual laws that are intended for all of society now and in the future. So for example, he's proclaimed the equality of women and men, the independent investigation of truth. These are new laws that are universally applicable today. On the other hand, we have another layer of Baha'i law, which is those Baha'i laws that are binding only on Baha'is, those who have accepted Baha'u'llah's revelation. And those include many of the personal laws, and I'll give some examples shortly. So it's always important to distinguish which Baha'i laws were intended only for Baha'is and which are intended for all of society. Another layer of Baha'i law relates to the Baha'i administrative order and the really remarkable and unprecedented system that Baha'u'llah has given us for managing the affairs of the Baha'i community, and we know ultimately the world community. So we have many laws that pertain to the functioning of local spiritual assemblies and national spiritual assemblies and regional Baha'i councils, and of course, the Universal House of Justice itself. Yet another layer of Baha'i law involves Baha'i teachings about what we might think of as secular law, national law as well as international law. And so many of the teachings directly relate to the secular legal order. And in fact, the Baha'i writings have a lot to say about how the nations of the world should regulate themselves through their legal systems, as well as how globally nations should be cooperating to develop an international law that facilitates their mutual peace as well as universal human rights. And then finally, there are actually Baha'i laws and teachings on how we might reconcile potential conflicts between Baha'i law and national or international law. So in the law world, we refer to such rules that deal with what happens when there's a conflict of rules as literally choice of law rules or even conflict of law rules. And the Baha'i revelation contains those as well, and I'll just explore a few of those.